Good morning and welcome to yet another episode of Coffee with Mr. V. And today I was thinking we could do something very quickly on fiscal policy, which is a mainstay of the first year course, theme 2 if you're doing A-level, or theme 2 even if you're doing the IB. But also it crops up so much in just macroeconomics in general that even into year 2 macroeconomics, it's going to come up again and again and again. And I'm just going to give some broad themes today with regards to fiscal policy. In order to participate with Coffee from Mr. V, please go and grab yourself a coffee or grab a liquid of your choosing, put it in a glass, a mug, or a cup. Come back here and we're going to do the synchronized sip, and that's going to be the best part of your day. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. I love coffee. So, fiscal policy. Fiscal policy then is distinct from monetary policy, where monetary policy is very much the remit of the central bank within a country. Fiscal policy then is the government. Okay, this is the levers. We sometimes call them the fiscal levers that the government has to affect changes in the economy, to try and achieve those macro objectives, to try and manipulate ADAS in order to achieve the macro objectives. The two tools then are government expenditure. That is G, the component of AD. AD, remember, has 5 components: C, I, G, X, and M. Okay, so that's G. And I've put here 800 billion because according to our sort of last figures of government expenditure in the UK government is spending around 800 billion pounds per year. Remember, right at this time, Rishi Sunak is our Chancellor of the Exchequer, so he is the chap in charge of, responsible for fiscal policy in the UK. And just before this kind of lockdown, coronavirus, he was doing the budget. Okay, fiscal policy is all about the budget, the relationship between G and T. And in that budget speech, he sets out the government's plans for spending and, as we'll see in a moment, taxation for the upcoming year. T, then, I've already alluded to, is taxation. This is where the government gains all of its tax revenue. What I was about to say is certain countries don't just rely on tax revenue as their source of revenue. For countries such as, the oil producing states of, say, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, a lot of money, a lot of government money is made from selling of oil because they are state-run industries. So they don't have to rely necessarily on taxation. And that's why places in the UAE, for example, have very low income tax rates. They can rely on revenue that is made from the oil production, the state oil production. In the UK, though, we don't have a lot of state-owned industries, and therefore we rely solely on tax revenue in order to fund our government spending. And at the moment, the last figures that we've got are 760 billion. So you can see there is a shortfall here between the amount of government spending and the amount of tax revenue that the UK government, spends in a given year. And we'll talk about that because that figure is only going to get higher now with Rishi Sunak's plans for getting out of this 2020 recession that is now coming up. So we'll need to talk about how that is funded. But in terms of just giving a broad generalization of what government spending is, we can break it down into 3 main terms, and I'm going to explain those here. So transfer payments. Transfer payments are those payments made by the government to citizens of a country or firms of a country where there is no economic output in return. Okay, so those citizens don't get anything in return. Think of it like a bank transfer. It's coming out of the government's bank account into somebody else's bank account, but there is no output changing hands. And for those of you who do the IB economics, remember that transfers should not be used in national income accounting. So when we actually work out GDP and we do C plus I plus G plus X minus M, we really shouldn't include any transfer spending in that. That's because no economic output was made in return. And GDP is all about measuring the financial value of economic output. Well, if I'm simply transferring money and there's no economic output in return, we simply shouldn't be including transfers in there. So what are we talking about? We're talking about unemployment benefits. We're talking about subsidies to firms. Subsidies, remember, don't have to be used in the production of anything. They could just be there to reduce costs for firms. And pensions is another big one for transfer payments. Current spending then is, we would expect some economic output in return. What we're really talking about there is public sector wages. So the wages for nurses, doctors, soldiers, state school teachers, people who provide a service on behalf of the government. So there is economic output here. Mainly it's a service, and that's the money that we're spending on those. It's sometimes referred to as short-term, regular spending that needs to be maintained. And what we're really talking about, as I say, are the wages of public sector staff. Capital expenditure is then very different from both of those in that it is, well, as it says, okay, the clue's in the title, it's government spending on capital goods. So the main form of that will be things like infrastructure, transportation networks, or indeed telecoms networks. Now, another reason for doing them as a list there, I can see that there's a slight, there we go, that's a bit better, is that I would consider these two to be very much demand side policies. So when you give people money as transfer payments, what you're hoping is that they'll spend it, particularly things with like pensions and unemployment benefits. You're hoping that those groups of people have very high marginal propensities to consume. So they will go out and spend it in abundance. Yeah, they'll spend most of their extra income. That's what high MPC actually says. So with these two, you're looking to get some sort of demand side stimulus going on, which will hopefully get you out of the recession. On the other hand, capital spending then is very much on the supply side. Now, of course, there will be a demand side effect because it is G, okay? It is government spending. More money is being injected into this circular flow. If you can remember your circular flow diagram, this is an injection of money. So we should be moving AD. It might not move to quite that extent because the multiplier might not perhaps be large. But nevertheless, we should move AD. But because we are building capital goods, infrastructure, telecoms and communication networks, they are all man-made resources or factors of production. We should also be thinking about shifting the AS curve outwards, okay? If I was doing this through a classical prism, okay, I would be talking about shifting the long-run average cost curve, wrong, aggregate supply curve to the right. I'm making a few errors here as I'm going through it, okay? So I'll repeat all of that. We're shifting the aggregate supply curve to the right, or if we're doing it through the classical prism, we're shifting the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right as well. This indicates that our PPF is shifting outwards. The potential growth for the economy, the potential output, is also shifting out because we have more capital goods. Or maybe if this is spending on capital in terms of R&D or human capital, remember those are both other forms of capital spending, then we could talk about the productivity or factors of production as well. But I think it's worth just having a look at those and thinking about the different effects, because although Keynes was very much of the kind of capital, we associate Keynes with capital expenditure, building ditches, building airports, building roads to get America out of the 1930s depression. What he was, the reason that was successful is because they were very labor intensive industries. It soaked up a lot of unemployment. It gave people who were without jobs and income, and therefore there was a very large multiplier in the economy. And we got or America got rather a very big demand side stimulus, lots of real GDP growth, and they also got lots of potential growth as well. Hence why America then goes on to become, you know, the global superpower that it was. In today's recession, where we're not really so bothered about potential growth, okay, with all these businesses declining due to this recession, no doubt Rishi Sunak's demand side stimulus is much more about these two, transfer payments, and indeed we might see some more current expenditure if we end up nationalizing certain industries, giving people money so that they can then go and spend it in the economy. So it's very much a demand side rather than the demand and a supply side as well. Anyway, I'm going to hold that there. Swiftly on then to taxation. Now, as a teacher, I mean, there's no neat kind of division of different taxes in the same way that there are these three types of government expenditure, but we could talk about direct taxes, taxes on income, taxes on wealth, taxes on individuals, on firms. Income tax and corporation tax are very good examples of direct taxes. Or similarly, you could talk about indirect taxes, which are the ones that could be passed on to somebody else to pay, which is like a sales tax, okay? Or another example might be an excise duty. So we talk about indirect and direct taxes. You could also talk about regressive and progressive taxes, but I'll leave that for another episode. You could talk about percentage and specific taxes, although we normally just leave that under there. So when you look at indirect taxes and the imposition of indirect taxes to fix certain market failures, you can do the difference there. And I might use that for my episode tomorrow, in fact. But really, okay, I choose these because they're three of the largest sources of tax revenue for any government, okay, not just in the UK. And for what it's worth, income tax is the largest in the UK. VAT or sales tax is the second largest. Corporation tax, I think, is the fourth. The one that's missing from that last list is national insurance contributions, but that's really like just a second type of income tax. I use these three because I think they make the point neatly for me about all the different effects you can have in an economy using taxation. So, for example, and I'll try and do the same thing that I've done here. Income tax. The income tax for me should be considered a demand side tax, although I will accept that it will have some sort of supply side impact. So, for example, if we're reducing income tax, I hope the first thing that you'll agree with is that AD should shift to the right, because if you're giving people more income or more disposable income, then they should be spending that. Consumption should increase. Consumption is the largest part of AD, and therefore AD increases to the right. People are demanding more goods and services. But it's also an incentive to work, all right, if you're reducing income tax. The logic goes that people who are, sat on the sofa, unwilling to work, will now look at the fall in income tax and decide, well, actually, it's now much more, it's more rational that I work. The benefits are larger than the costs. I should go out and seek employment because I'm getting more money from working than I would do sat on the sofa claiming job seekers allowance or whatever it might be. I am not particularly keen on shifting AS to the right that much because I don't really know how many people that affects. I think it probably depends on the size of the change with the income tax. It probably depends on the amount of job seekers allowance in a particular economy. In the UK at the moment, we only have 1 million people unemployed. So therefore, if I reduce income tax, is it really going to have such a large effect? I don't think so. Okay, so some people will say this is also a supply side policy. My definition of a supply side policy, though, is the main aim, the main reason for doing it is to shift the supply side. I can't believe that this would ever be the main reason why you would reduce income tax to affect the supply side. If you want to do the supply side, there are much more direct ways of doing it. Education and training programs, building new rail networks or building new roads. There are better ways to affect the supply side than simply reducing income tax. I do accept it has small supply side effect, but I would argue this is much more of a direct demand side policy. Corporation tax, I realize I'm skipping sales tax for a moment, but I'll come back to that. Corporation tax is similar, but almost the other way around in a sense. I would expect if I decrease corporation tax, I would expect to have a small increase in aggregate demand, okay? Because when you reduce corporation tax, you are hoping, your expectation is that firms will have more profit at the end of the tax year, and you would hope that they might then reinvest that profit, because firms only really have two choices of what to do with profit. They can give it to shareholders as dividends, or they can reinvest it. Regardless of whether they're giving more to shareholders or doing R&D, you anticipate that there will be more investment overall. So investment should increase. But investment is usually a much smaller component of AD than consumption. So I think it's more like it's likely to have a smaller effect on AD. On the other hand, if they are doing all of this investment, if they are building larger factories, if they are buying more machines or investing in R&D to get better machines, then you would expect them to be a much larger shift in AS. So that one is kind of similar to what we said about capital goods over there. So income tax and corporation tax have very similar effects, but almost the balance is different. Income tax is very much big changes on AD, small change on AS. For me, corporation tax is small change on AD, but a much larger change of AS. And this is why, for me, corporation tax or reducing corporation tax should be, I think, considered a supply side policy. Sales taxes then. Sales taxes are slightly different to all of the above. And when we talked about sales tax in microeconomics, let's reduce sales tax for now. We would be doing this if we were reducing sales tax, if we were reducing excise duty, or if we were reducing VAT. So this is happening in our micro market. If we're doing this for all markets, because sales taxes affect all goods and services in the economy, then we should simply be trying to reflect that with our macro AS curve. So AS1 would shift downwards to AS2. If you prefer the classical lens, then simply think about it in these terms, okay? That we have shifted the short run aggregate supply curve to the right. That's the same for me as in the Keynesian diagram, shifting the AS curve downwards. We didn't change the demand curve in the microeconomic diagram, so I don't see any reason to change the demand curve in the macro diagram. So what have we got? Well, we've had an extension in aggregate demand from Q1 to Q2 in our micro diagram, and we'll do the same here, but in the macro diagram we call it Y1 to Y2. And if we're saying that this is now the classical macro, then that really should be Y1 and Y2 as well. The big impact here then, we did get an increase in real GDP. There is greater demand. The quantity being demanded, the real GDP being demanded has increased. So more goods and services are being demanded. Therefore, you would expect to see a small reduction in cyclical unemployment. But the main effect was to reduce the price level, to bring inflationary pressure downwards in the economy. So for me, I don't think sales taxes really come into the bracket of demand side or supply side. Okay, it doesn't shift the AD curve for me very much. If at all, I see it as a movement along the AD curve rather than a shift of the AD curve. And it doesn't shift the long run aggregate supply curve. It doesn't shift the vertical component of the Keynesian AES curve. And so therefore, I'm loath to put it in any demand side or supply side bracket. For me, this is simply a way of either increasing tax revenue if you were to push sales taxes upwards, or reducing tax revenue if you were to push it downwards. And the reason you might do that, therefore, is simply to reduce inflationary pressure if that's what you've got in your economy. So to sum up then, fiscal policy doesn't need to be demand side or supply side necessarily, okay? It can be either. You can have fiscal supply side policies and fiscal demand side policies. I would say probably the majority of the time, if people are talking about expansionary fiscal policy, or they just leave out any adjective and just call it fiscal policy, they're probably talking about demand side policies, okay? That would be the assumption that I would make. But don't think that fiscal policies can't be supply side, or that supply side policies are somehow different from fiscal policies. Supply side policies for me are any policy whose main aim, the real reason, the main purpose of the tax is to shift that AS curve to the right, or the long run aggregate supply curve to the right. Okay, they can be fiscal policies as well. They could be through G, capital spending, or they could be through T, reduction of corporation taxes, or maybe something like reduction of business rates as well. Business rates, remember, are the business equivalent or the firm equivalent of council taxes. Okay, that might also incentivize investment as well. So there we have it. These are the kind of the main levers of fiscal policy. 3 types of government expenditure, 3 types of taxes, and I'm looking here now at the different effects that they have on AD and AS. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you tomorrow.